She had blood on her cheek and every eye in that marble hall watching her. She didn't cry. She didn't curse. She picked up every piece of scattered gear with bare hands, while the cadets above laughed and Cadet Captain Elias Vance walked away without looking back. Nobody moved to help her. Nobody thought she mattered. That was their first mistake, because the woman bleeding on the Ironcrest steps wasn't a struggling scholarship cadet trying to survive military academy. She was something those marble halls had never seen before, and by the time they figured that out, it was already too late. If this kind of story is what you live for military drama, buried secrets, the quiet ones who destroy everything, subscribe right now and hit that bell so you never miss what's coming next. Drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And if you're already hooked, you should smash that like button and let's get into it. The marble steps of Ironcrest Military Academy were not designed to be climbed easily. That was deliberate. The Academy's original architect, a retired general named Aldous Crane, who believed that the first test of any soldier was whether they could endure discomfort without complaint, had specified each riser be 4 inches taller than civilian building code. The steps were also slightly narrower than standard, which meant that anyone carrying a full rucksack and a helmet bag had to angle their body sideways or risk bumping the iron railings that ran up both sides. Ironcrest graduates had their own private joke about the steps. If you can climb them without cursing on your first day, you're either lying or you have no imagination. Mara Quinn had climbed them before. Not these particular steps, not this particular building, but she had memorized the architectural layout 2 weeks before her enrollment date, from a floor plan she'd requested through a channel most people in this building didn't know existed. She knew the rise height. She knew the railing spacing. She knew that the acoustic properties of the marble caused voices to carry farther than speakers typically expected, which meant that whatever was said on these steps was effectively broadcast to anyone in the entry hall below. She knew all of this, and still she almost went down hard when Elias Vance's boot heel connected with her ankle. It wasn't aggressive enough to look intentional. That was the craft of it. He moved through the cluster of cadets, descending from the upper briefing rooms, with the comfortable authority of someone accustomed to crowds parting for him. Shoulders back, chin up, the easy physical confidence of a man who had never once in his life needed to make himself smaller. His elbow caught a junior cadet's shoulder. His boot found Mara's heel. The timing was fluid enough that a camera might have captured it as an accident. His expression when he glanced back told a different story. The glance lasted maybe half a second, long enough to register that she was going down, long enough for something satisfied to pass through his eyes before he turned forward again. His voice carried perfectly in the marble acoustics. Get out of the way, Ghost. Some of us have a war to prepare for. A few of the cadets around him laughed. Not all of them, maybe 4 or 5. The ones who understood that laughing at Vance's jokes was a form of social currency at Ironcrest. The rest went quiet in the particular way people go quiet when they're watching something they don't want to be associated with, but aren't willing to stop. Mara's left knee hit the stone first, then her right palm. The helmet bag swung forward on its strap and cracked against the riser edge, the impact hard enough that she heard the rattle of the chin strap hardware. Her main rucksack shifted off her shoulder with the momentum of the fall and hit the steps above her, tumbling twice before catching on the railing. The contents didn't spill. She'd packed with compression straps and internal dividers, a habit she'd developed somewhere she wasn't allowed to discuss, but the bag itself hung awkwardly half off the step. She felt the blood before she processed the pain. Her cheek had caught the corner of a riser. Not deep, but enough. A warm line running from cheekbone toward jaw. The hall went quiet. Mara Quinn stayed still for exactly 2 seconds. Not from shock. She was cataloging. The blood, the position of the bag, the angle of her knee on the stone, the sound of Vance's boots continuing upward without pause. She noted that 17 cadets were currently visible, in her peripheral vision, none moving to help. She noted that the entry hall below had at least 30 more, most of whom had turned to look. Then she stood up. She retrieved the helmet bag first, checked the hardware, slung it correctly, pulled the rucksack off the railing and settled it across the railing and settled it across both shoulders, adjusting the sternum strap with 2 practiced clicks. She touched her cheek with the back of her hand, looked at the blood briefly, and continued climbing. She didn't look at Vance. She didn't look at the cadets who'd laughed. She didn't look at anyone. Above her, on the mezzanine overlooking the entry hall, General Adrian Thorne stood, with his hands clasped behind his back, and watched the entire sequence with an expression that could have meant anything. The Academy formally designated Mara Quinn as a scholarship cadet, classification 3, which was the quiet, institutional way of saying she was here on need-based funding, not legacy connection or distinguished service lineage. Scholarship 3s got assigned to the East dormitory block, which hadn't been renovated since the early part of the previous decade and had radiators that knocked in the morning at 3 and then like someone trying to escape from inside the wall. They got first-year lockers on the lower rack, which flooded twice a year when the plumbing in the East Wing backed up. They ate at the East Side mess tables, which were positioned closest to the kitchen noise and farthest from the windows. None of this was official policy. It was just how things were at Ironcrest. Mara's roommate was a cadet named Dina Roth, a lanky pre-med track candidate from somewhere in the Midwest who communicated primarily in single syllables and had taped a hand-drawn periodic table to her side of the wall. She looked up when Mara came in, registered the blood on her cheek and the general state of her gear, and said, "Bad steps?" with the tone of someone who had personal experience with the question. "I tripped," Mara said. Dina looked at her for a moment. "Sure," she said, and went back to her periodic table. Mara set her rucksack on the bunk, unclipped the top flap, and removed a small first aid pouch. She cleaned her cheek in the bathroom mirror with the unhurried focus of someone performing routine maintenance. Antiseptic wipe. Steri-strip closure done. The cut would leave a faint mark for a week or two. She'd had worse from briefing table corners. She sat on the bunk and pulled out her Academy orientation packet, the physical copy, not the digital file, because she preferred to annotate by hand, and opened it to the operational schedule section. Tomorrow's training calendar, equipment assignments, company rosters. She found her name in the blue company list and traced her finger across the row until she reached the notation for the Black Meridian Exercise, scheduled for day 3. She read the exercise description twice, then set the packet down and stared at the ceiling. Blue company, she thought. Of course. The first 48 hours at Ironcrest were assessment hours. No formal grades officially. No zine officially. But everyone knew that the instructors were watching, ranking, building the mental models that would determine how much attention each cadet received for the following weeks. It was the sort of institutional open secret that Academy culture depended on and, officially, denied. Elias Vance understood this viscerally and performed accordingly. He was, by any objective measure, exceptional. Mara had studied his file, a habit she'd developed, reviewing files on key personnel in any new environment, and the file was genuinely impressive. Highest physical fitness scores in his admission cohort. Combat Tactics Practicum, top 3. Strategic Planning Assessment, distinguished. He'd grown up in a military family 3 generations deep, had attended a prep school that ran its own junior officer training program, and had arrived at Ironcrest already fluent in the vocabulary and rhythm of institutional military culture, in a way most cadets spent their first semester trying to learn. He was also the kind of person who had never, not once, been required to consider whether the spot they occupied was earned or simply given. Mara watched him lead a land navigation exercise on day 2 from a position in the middle of the group, deliberately unremarkable, maintaining the easy urge pace that kept her out of both the front and back of the formation. Vance moved at the head without consulting his compass, calling out bearing corrections from memory, and he was, she had to acknowledge it clearly, mostly right. When he was slightly off, he self-corrected fast, reading terrain scene features rather than instrument. The man could navigate. That part wasn't performance. The part that was performance came during the after-action debrief, when Cadet Sergeant Miles Okafor misread a grid reference and lost 2 minutes at the third waypoint. Vance waited until Okafor finished his explanation, then said, with the particular tone that left no fingerprints, "Good thing it wasn't a real mission. Otherwise, we'd all be dead because of your compass work." He smiled when he said it. That was the craft again, the smile that made it sound like banter when it wasn't banter at all. Okafor's jaw tightened. He nodded once, said nothing. Mara noted this. She also noted that 3 of the instructors present didn't react, which was its own data point. After the debrief, she lingered near the equipment return station until the crowd thinned, then approached the instructor who'd run the exercise, a compact, weathered sergeant first class named Decker, whose name tape and deployment patches she'd cataloged on day 1. "Sergeant Decker," she said, "I had a question about the grid reference format used on Leg 3. The annotation style was different from what was in the orientation manual." Decker looked at her with the faint wariness instructor felt for cadets, who asked questions at the end of long days. "It's military grid reference system, cadet. Standard format." "Yes, sir. I noticed the orientation manual uses the 6-digit system, but the exercise waypoint cards were in 8-digit. I just want to make sure I'm interpreting them correctly." Something shifted in Decker's expression. Not warmth, exactly. More like recognition. "You're right. The exercise cards are higher precision. Most cadets don't catch that. I wanted to make sure I wasn't making an error." "You weren't." He paused. "Quinn, right?" "Yes, sir." He looked at her for a moment in the way that people sometimes looked at things they couldn't quite categorize. Then he said, "Carry on," and turned away. Mara returned to the East Dormitory and spent the next 3 hours in the common room with the Black Meridian Exercise simulation manual, reading in a chair near the far wall, where the overhead light was best and the traffic was lowest. The manual was 230 pages. She read it straight through, making no notes, trusting the part of her memory that had been specifically trained for retention. She got to page 187 before Dina appeared in the doorway, looked at her, and said, "It's midnight." "I know. You know most people just skim it and wing it, right?" Mara turned a page. "I know." Dina stood there for a moment, apparently deciding whether to invest further in this conversation. She decided against it and left. Mara kept reading. Day 3. The briefing for the Black Meridian Exercise happened at 530 in the main operations room, a high-ceilinged chamber with a wall-size topographic display and seating for 300. Mara took a seat in the middle of the room, 4 rows back from the front, visible enough not to be invisible, back enough not to draw attention. The exercise director, a lieutenant colonel named Priest, with the unsmiling precision of someone who had personally designed every element of this scenario, walked them through the parameters with the brisk efficiency of a person who had given this exact briefing 16 times. The Black Meridian Exercise was a full-scale simulation involving the Academy's entire cadet corps, divided into 2 opposing forces and run across a full-scale training complex that covered nearly 40 acres of the Academy's operational grounds. Red Company and Blue Company. Red Company was the assault force, Blue the defense. The exercise had been run every year for 11 years. Blue Company had never won. The structural imbalance was intentional, Lieutenant Colonel Priest explained, with the slight satisfaction of someone who enjoyed watching people process difficult information. Blue Company receives under-equipped units, degraded communications, and reduced personnel. This is by design. The scenario models asymmetric conflict, a smaller resource-poor force defending against a superior attacker. The learning outcome is not whether Blue wins. It's how Blue's command structure responds to attrition, pressure, and cascading failure. From 3 rows ahead, Mara heard Vance say something quiet to the cadet next to him. She didn't catch the words, but she caught the tone and the half-beat of suppressed laughter that followed. She looked at the topographic display. 40 acres. Simulated urban environment, mixed terrain on the south, a network of subsurface maintenance corridors running beneath the central maintenance corridors, running beneath the central training complex that the schematic identified as the Meridian infrastructure grid. The briefing materials describe these corridors as non-operational for simulation purposes, not for use by either company. She noted that non-operational for simulation purposes and prohibited were not the same phrase. Lieutenant Colonel Priest was still talking. Red Company assignment. Cadet Captain Elias Vance, commanding. Blue Company assignment. The name of Blue Company's assigned commander was a cadet named Holt, a second-year student, who immediately developed the expression of a person who had just been handed something they didn't want to hold. Mara's name came out in the middle of the Blue Company roster, unremarkably, between a cadet named Marsh and a cadet named Park. She wrote nothing. She needed to write nothing. The briefing ended. The cadets filed out into the gray pre-dawn light, sorting themselves towards their respective assembly areas. Mara moved with the Blue Company group, taking her place in the rear left cluster where the equipment issue station was being set up. Blue Company's gear allocation was immediately visibly inferior older radio sets, reduced ammunition equivalents for the simulation's laser tag system, less body armor, and one of the 3 designated vehicles had a mechanical failure tag on its windshield that meant it counted as non-operational for the exercise. Cadet Holt stood in front of the assembled Blue Company and looked at his force with the expression of a man doing math in his head and not liking the results. "Okay," Holt said. Let's go over the defensive grid." He went over the defensive grid. It was a reasonable plan for a force that had adequate resources, which they didn't. Mara listened completely, said nothing, and noted 3 specific structural problems with the plan that Holt hadn't addressed. She also noted that her ankle, from the fall on the Ironcrest steps, was still tender. She'd wrapped it that morning with athletic tape, the same way she'd wrapped it a dozen times before, in a dozen different places she wasn't allowed to name. It would hold. When Holt finished, he looked around. Questions? A few. Mara raised her hand once. Asked a technical question about the radio protocol for the eastern sector. Sounded procedural. But was actually testing whether Holt knew that Blue Company's degraded radio sets operated on a slightly different frequency range than the standard kit, which meant their signal would drop in 2 specific geographic locations on the map. Holt answered the question without demonstrating knowledge of the frequency issue, which confirmed what Mara needed to know. "Got it," she said. "Thank you." She took her assigned position at the south wall of the simulation complex and waited. The exercise started at 700 with a simulated artillery sequence, a series of loudspeaker bursts, and strobe lights mounted around the perimeter that were designed to create confusion and sensory disorientation in the opening minutes. Standard doctrine. The instructors had pulled this from actual offensive opening sequences, the kind of thing that showed up in the tactical literature, with phrases like initiating, action, and degrading command coherence. It worked on most of the Blue Company cadets immediately. Mara watched Cadet Park, stationed 20 feet to her left, flinch back from a strobe burst and drop his radio handset. It took him 4 seconds to recover it and key the channel. 4 seconds wasn't a long time in ordinary life. In the simulation scoring system, which ran on 2-second interval ticks, it was enough to mark his position as compromised. Mara had positioned herself in the shadow of a structural column at the south wall's corner, where the strobe placement had a dead zone. She'd identified the dead zone from the training complex schematic in the exercise manual and she'd confirmed it by watching the strobe cycling pattern for the first 45 seconds of the sequence before taking her position. Her radio crackled. Holt's voice. "All blue units. Red Company is moving in from the North Corridor. Fall back to secondary positions. Fall back to secondary positions was the plan. It was also, Mara thought, going to accelerate their collapse by about 20 minutes, because the secondary positions placed Blue Company's remaining force in a tighter cluster that Red Company's flanking units would be able to encircle once they cleared the North Corridor's choke point. She keyed her radio. "Holt, this is Quinn. South sector is clear. If you pull back now, you're opening the east flank." A pause. "Roger, Quinn. Proceed as ordered." She released the key. "Fair enough." She started moving. The Meridian infrastructure grid's access points were marked on the schematic with small circular symbols that the briefing materials described as maintenance hatches. The nearest one was 18 meters from her current position, built into the floor of the training complex near a row of equipment lockers. It had a handle. She had a hand. The manual had said the corridors were non-operational for simulation purposes. It had not said they were locked. The hatch lifted on the second pull. There was a sticky point in the mechanism, and Mara lowered herself into the subsurface network with her radio set, her simulation kit, and a small tactical light that she kept on its lowest setting. The corridor was concrete, maybe 5 feet wide and 6 high, with bundled cable runs along the ceiling and the smell of recycled air from the building's climate system. She moved quickly, reading the route from memory. Above her, the simulation was playing out on its expected trajectory. She could hear the loudspeaker outputs, explosion simulations, radio chatter from the exercise control room broadcasting ambient noise on the open channel, and occasionally the hard chime. That meant someone's sensor vest had registered a hit. Blue Company was taking hits. She'd known they would. That was the exercise design. What the exercise design hadn't accounted for was someone navigating the infrastructure grid. She reached the junction she'd mapped in her memory, a T-intersection, where the North Corridor branched toward the base of the operations center, and stopped. She pulled out a small notebook, not for notes, but because it had a reflective surface on the back cover that let her read the faint ambient light around the next corner without exposing herself. The corridor was empty. She moved to the communications relay box she'd identified on the schematic. It was a standard training complex junction panel, the kind of unit that managed the exercise's internal network, including the sensor feeds that fed the exercise control room's scoring system. She opened the panel access door. Inside was exactly what the technical appendix of the exercise manual had described: a digital relay board with clearly labeled ports and a status display running on battery backup. She didn't touch the relay board. She was not here to sabotage equipment. That wasn't the play. She was here because the relay board's position meant she was now directly beneath the junction where Red Company's command post had established its network connection, a detail she knew because she'd read the Red Company operations annex that had been in the exercise packet as a reference document for Blue Company commanders to understand their opposition's doctrine. Most people skimmed it. She'd read it fully. Red Company's command post was processing its sensor feeds through this relay, which meant she could hear their internal radio traffic. She keyed her own set to the frequency listed in the technical appendix as the relay's monitoring channel. Not a hack, not a breach, just a matter of knowing the manual, and listened. Vance's voice came through clean and confident. "Echo element, confirm. You've cleared Sector 4. We should be through their command structure in the next 8 minutes. Echo confirms Sector 4 clear. Blue Company command has gone quiet. I think they're collapsing. They are collapsing." A pause. "Where's that flanking unit? West Corridor should have hit their secondary line 4 minutes ago. Still moving up. Narrow Corridor is slowing their advance." Mara filed this information and began moving north. The narrow corridor that was slowing Red Company's western flanking unit was the same corridor system she was now inside. The Meridian grid ran parallel to it. She moved faster, tracking her position against the memorized schematic, counting meters. She found her first access point, a hatch that opened into a storage room behind Blue Company's secondary position. She came up slowly, checked the room, found it empty, and keyed her radio. "Park, this is Quinn. I'm in your sector. Do not shoot me." A long pause. "Quinn, where the hell are you?" Holt said. "Listen carefully and don't repeat this on open channel. Red Company's western flank is 40 meters from your position and moving through a bottleneck. If you put 2 people at the corridor intersection, now not in the open, behind the equipment sysks, they'll have angle on the entire approach. Holt's orders are, I know what Holt's orders are. I'm telling you what's about to happen. You can choose." Another pause. Then, what do I tell them? Tell them it's a sensor delay exploit. Red Company's thermal equipment runs a 2-second lag at corners. If your people move into position before Red Company clears the bottleneck, they'll be invisible to the thermal scan until they're already in firing angle. She had read this in the technical specifications of the Red Company's equipment manifest, which had also been in the exercise packet. The 2-second thermal lag was a documented characteristic of the training complex's simulation sensors. Not classified, just unread. The sound of Park relaying the instruction. Then boots moving. Mara descended back into the corridor and kept moving. Over the next 40 minutes, she moved through the infrastructure grid like a current running through wire, surfacing at 3 more access points long enough to pass information, a timing sequence here, a blind angle there, a power routing detail that let one blue element cut the visual feed to a Red Company advance unit by triggering a specific circuit in a corridor junction box, which she'd identified from the building's maintenance schematic as a standard exercise safety feature that was technically accessible to anyone who read the right appendix. She wasn't directing Blue Company. She was feeding them data they didn't have and letting them make choices. The choices accumulated. At 821, Red Company's vehicle element stalled in the north approach when a routing instruction came through their net broadcast on their own channel, through the relay she'd monitored, in Vance's own code format, directing them to a holding position while command assessed a sensor anomaly, say. The routing instruction had been sent from a secondary transmitter in the infrastructure grid, in Vance's code format, which she had reconstructed from listening to his radio traffic for 40 minutes. She was not impersonating command. The instruction was technically valid. She had simply introduced a delay that didn't exist. At 834, she found the access point she'd been navigating toward since the exercise began, the one that came up inside the storage room at the base of Vance's command post. Sect. She climbed up slowly. The storage room was dim, smelling of old equipment padding and the particular dry electric smell of active radio equipment running on the other side of the wall. She could hear Vance through the wall, not clearly, but enough. His voice had a different quality now than it had in the briefing room. Still controlled, but working harder at the control. She checked her sensor vest. Green, no hits. She was still live. She checked the door at the far end of the storage room. The handle moved. She pulled it open 1 centimeter and looked through the gap. Vance's command post was a repurposed office. In the training complex, 3 folding tables, 2 radio sets, a laptop running the exercise's tactical display, and 4 cadets, including Vance. The display showed Red Company's positions in green and Blue Company's in red, and the red markers were doing things the green expected, except in 2 places where the display was showing anomalies that his operators were trying to interpret. "Someone's feeding them data," said one of the cadets. At the radio, a sharp-looking young man with sergeant's tabs, who was staring at his display with the furrowed concentration of someone who could see a problem but couldn't yet name it. Blue Company's response patterns are too coordinated for their command structure. Blue Company doesn't have a command structure left, Vance said. Then why is our Western element still in the bottleneck? A silence. Mara pushed the door fully open and walked in. The first person to see her was the sergeant at the radio, who went very still in the way people go still when Something has entered their threat perception before their brain has finished classifying it. Then Vance turned. He stared at her. She was covered in dust from the infrastructure corridor. Her uniform was marked with the black streaks of concrete contact at the knee and elbow. Her cheek had the starry strip still in place, the skin around it faintly bruised now, going toward purple at the edges. She was carrying no weapon. Her sensor vest was green. How Vance started. She crossed the distance between them in 9 steps. Her hand came up and she touched his shoulder, flat palm, the formal contact required by the exercise rules to register a commander capture. The overhead speakers in the training complex activated simultaneously. The voice of the exercise control room broadcast through every sector. Red Company Commander neutralized. Simulation score, Blue Company tactical victory. Exercise terminated. The strobe lights had died. The ambient noise track cut off. The training complex went to emergency fluorescent lighting, and the particular silence of a large space that has suddenly stopped pretending to be something else. Vance hadn't moved. He was still looking at her. Mara lowered her hand. She looked at him for exactly as long as it took to confirm that he'd registered what had happened, and then she looked away because she'd never needed him to understand in this moment. Understanding would come later, from other people, in forms he wouldn't be able to walk away from. She walked to the door, stepped through, and stood in the empty corridor of the training complex. Through the wall, she heard the sergeant at the radio say, in a very quiet voice, she came through the infrastructure grid. And then, even quieter, clearly not meant to be heard, she read the whole manual. Outside, through the training complex's narrow window slits, the day was getting brighter. Mara Quinn stood alone in the corridor with dust on her uniform and blood bruise on her cheek, and she let herself take exactly one slow breath before she heard the sound of approaching boots from the observation level above purposeful, multiple, the rhythm of senior officers moving with intent. General Thorne's voice, from somewhere she couldn't yet see, carrying in the acoustics the way voices always carried in this building. Get me her file. Not a question, not a request, an order, and the tone of a man who had just realized he didn't know what he was looking at. The boots on the observation level weren't moving fast. That was the detail that registered first, not the number of them, not the direction, but the pace. Deliberate, measured. The kind of walking that senior officers did when they already knew where they were going and didn't need to hurry to prove it. Mara stayed in the corridor. She didn't move toward the sound, and she didn't move away from it. She stood with her back to the wall, the dust still on her uniform, and waited. The door at the end of the corridor opened, and Sergeant First Class Decker came through first, not because he was in charge of whatever was happening, but because that was apparently his role at this moment. The man who opened the door ahead of the people who mattered. Behind him came a junior aide carrying a tablet, and behind the aide came General Adrian Thorne, and the expression on Thorne's face was not readable in any simple way. It wasn't anger. It wasn't approval. It was the look of a man recalibrating. He stopped 6 feet from Mara and looked at her the way you look at something you thought you understood 5 minutes ago. Walk with me, Cadet Quinn. It wasn't a question. Mara pushed off the wall and fell into step beside him, slightly back, the correct position. Decker and the aide stayed behind. Thorne moved through the training complex without looking at her, his hands clasped at the small of his back. They passed through a fire door and into the external corridor and into the external corridors that ran the length of the north face, and through the narrow windows, Mara could see the training grounds below Blue Company and Red Company personnel, filtering out of their sectors, milling in the flat morning light with the slightly stunned quality of people whose expected outcome had not occurred. Thorne spoke without preamble. The infrastructure grid. Yes, sir. That corridor system is listed in the exercise documentation as non-operational. Non-operational for simulation purposes, sir. Not prohibited. A pause. You're telling me you found a language distinction in the exercise manual and decided to exploit it. I'm telling you the manual said what it said, sir. He stopped walking. She stopped with him. He turned and looked at her directly, for the first time since they'd started moving, and she met the look without looking away, because looking away would have been its own kind of tell. How much of that manual did you read? He said. All of it, sir. When? Night before the exercise. Common room. East dormitory block. Something moved through his face, brief, controlled, gone, before it fully arrived. You read a 230-page technical document the night before the exercise. Yes, sir. And retained it. Yes, sir. He studied her for another moment. Then he turned and kept walking. You're Blue Company. You were supposed to lose. I know. The exercise is designed so Blue Company loses. That's the point of the exercise. I understand the design intent, sir. Then explain to me, he said, and his tone had shifted slightly, not warmer, but more direct, like he'd dropped one layer of the formal register, what you were actually doing in there. Mara took a breath. The scenario models asymmetric conflict. A smaller force with fewer resources defending against a superior attacker. Lieutenant Colonel Priest said the learning outcome was how Blue Company's command structure responded to cascading failure. She paused. The learning outcome, he didn't say out loud, was whether anyone in Blue Company would stop reacting to the conditions they were given and start working the conditions that weren't in the brief. Thorne said nothing. Red Company's advantage was equipment and numbers, not information. Their information picture had the same gaps as Blue's. They just didn't know it because they'd never needed to look for gaps. They expected to win, so they operated the way you operate when you expect to win. She glanced at him once. That's exploitable. You exploited a 2-second thermal lag in a sensor system. It was in the equipment manifest, sir. Page 194. They reached the end of the corridor, and Thorne stopped at the window, looking out. Below, the training ground had settled into the post-exercise processing stage instructors, with tablets moving through the cadet groups, recording scores, conducting initial debrief interviews. Mark could see Vance from here, standing slightly apart from his Red Company cadets, arms crossed, face doing something she couldn't read at this distance. Sergeant First Class Decker tells me you asked him about grid reference notation on day 2, Thorne said. Yes, sir. He said most cadets don't notice the format discrepancy. I noticed it. You also corrected a bearing calculation during the land navigation exercise, without appearing to correct it. Decker noted that too. He turned from the window. You've been here 72 hours. She said nothing, because there was nothing useful to add. Where are you from, Cadet Quinn? The question sounded casual. It was not a casual question. Oregon, sir. Originally, he repeated. The word hung in the air with a slight weight. He let it sit there and didn't push further, and she noted that a general who knew how to leave a silence empty and watch what someone put in it. She put nothing in it. He nodded once, the kind of nod that meant the conversation was over and he'd gotten whatever he came for. Get cleaned up. Full debrief is at 1300. Yes, sir. He walked back the way they'd come. Mara stood at the window and looked out at the training grounds and at Vance below and at the Ironcrest building across the quad with its 2 tall marble steps catching the morning light, and she thought about the 72 hours ahead of her, which were going to be considerably more complicated than the 72 behind. The debrief at 1300 was held in the main operations room, with the full cadet corps assembled, which was unusual. Standard post-exercise debriefs happened by company, not full formation. The fact that every cadet, every instructor, and 3 additional senior officers that Mara hadn't seen before were now seated in the tiered auditorium seating said something about how the morning had been received at the institutional level. Mara sat in the middle of the Blue Company section, her uniform cleaned and pressed, the starry strip on her cheek replaced with a fresh one. Her ankle was wrapped beneath her boot. She sat with her hands on her knees and her back straight, and her expression at the comfortable neutral that she'd learned to maintain in rooms where too many people were looking for something to look at. Lieutenant Colonel Priest stood at the front and delivered the exercise breakdown with his usual surgical brevity. Blue Company win. First in 11 years. Red Company commander captured. Exercise terminated at 836.22 minutes ahead of the expected Blue Company collapse window. Then he did something he'd never done in 11 years of running this exercise. He asked for the tactical breakdown from the Blue Company element that had executed the winning sequence. Every head in the room turned. Mara was aware of this, the way you're aware of weather not alarming, just a condition that existed. Cadet Holt, to his credit, stood up and immediately said, "It wasn't me, sir." Then he sat back down. Priest looked at the Blue Company section. Cadet Quinn. She stood. The room had a particular kind of quiet, not the polite quiet of people being respectful, but the tighter quiet of people who were genuinely not sure what they were about to hear. Mara had been in rooms with this quality of silence before, in contexts she wasn't thinking about right now. "Walk us through it," Priest said. She did. She kept it technical and precise, and she spoke at a pace that matched the room's attention level, which she calibrated in the first 30 seconds by watching the instructors. She covered the infrastructure grid access, the frequency monitoring, the thermal lag exploitation, the command post-penetration. She cited page numbers where relevant. She did not editorialize, and she did not apologize for anything. When she finished, the room was still quiet, but a different kind. Priest looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Sit down," and turned to face the full assembly. What Cadet Quinn has just described is not a violation of the exercise parameters. The relevant documentation language which I wrote says non-operational, not prohibited. He paused. That was an oversight on my part. I'll own it. This was not the kind of thing lieutenant colonels typically said in full corps assembly. Several instructors exchanged looks. The larger point, Priest continued, is that Cadet Quinn identified a gap in the information environment that every other cadet in this room on both sides failed to identify, and she operated in that gap with a degree of precision and restraint that produced a tactically valid outcome. He moved to his tablet. She also at no point violated the spirit of the exercise. She found an edge that existed within the rules and used it. That is exactly what asymmetric warfare doctrine asks for. From somewhere in the Red Company section, Mara heard a low sound, not quite a word, not quite nothing. She didn't look to see where it came from. She had a reasonable guess. After the debrief, the Cadet Corps broke into the informal milling period that always followed high-structure events, when the institutional framework loosened enough for people to have unscripted conversations. Mara moved toward the exit with the middle wave of people, not first, not last. She almost made it, Quinn. The voice came from her right and slightly behind. She knew who it was before she turned, because she'd been tracking the voice since the debrief began not consciously, the way you don't consciously hear a sound that your threat system has already categorized. Vance was standing with two of his Red Company cadets at his shoulders, close enough to suggest a social situation, far enough to maintain deniability. He was in clean uniform, expression settled, and whatever she'd seen on his face from the window earlier had been replaced with something harder to read. "Good exercise," he said. The phrasing was technically neutral. His tone made it something else. "Thank you," she said. That's an interesting word. He tilted his head slightly. "I was going to say unusual." He paused. The infrastructure grid. "That's a nice little trick. It was in the manual." Uh-huh. He looked at her in the way that people look at things they're deciding how to categorize. "You know what's also in the manual? The section on authorized communication channels. The section that says simulation personnel are not supposed to access exercise control systems." Mara looked at him. "I monitored a relay channel that's listed in the technical appendix as a training support tool. I didn't access the control system. You broadcast a routing instruction on our command frequency in your code format, which you broadcast in clear on a channel I was monitoring. A beat. He stopped. Started again. That's a creative reading of the rules. Priest said it was within parameters. Priest said it was an oversight he'd fix. Vance's voice stayed level, but there was something happening underneath it, not quite anger, more like the particular frustration of someone who has never before had to explain why something felt wrong when all the technical facts said it wasn't. You exploited a gap, fine. But you also made Blue Company look like they had competent leadership, and they didn't. They had you running an off-book operation that nobody knew about. Holt knew. He chose not to countermand. Holt was running on desperation. He didn't know what you were doing. That's an argument about Blue Company's command structure, not about what I did. The cadets at his shoulders were doing the careful stillness of people who understood they were witnessing something they'd be asked about later. One of them, shorter, with the kind of watchful eyes that belonged on someone smarter than their rank suggested, was looking at Mara with an expression that wasn't hostile. Vance stepped closer. Not threatening. He was too calibrated for something that obvious, but enough to make the intent clear. I'm going to ask you something, and I want a straight answer. She waited. Where did you learn to read a room like that? It was not the question she'd expected. She let a beat pass before answering. I don't know what you mean, sir. Don't do that. He said it without heat, which was more interesting than if he'd said it with heat. The way you moved in there, the way you used the radio traffic. That's not Cadet Academy skill. That's something you learned somewhere else. So where? She held his gaze. I read the manual, Cadet Captain. A long silence. Right, he said. He stepped back. The hardness in his expression didn't move. Well, good exercise. He turned and walked, and his cadets moved with him, and the one with the watchful eyes glanced back once before they were through the door. Mara turned and kept walking. The hallway outside the operations room ran the length of the east wing, ending at a set of double doors that opened onto the internal quad. She pushed through them into the afternoon air and stood for a moment on the narrow stone landing outside. The quad spread below her, the Ironcrest building visible across the open space, with its marble steps catching the late afternoon light. She heard the door behind her open. She didn't turn. Dina Roth's voice, you know the entire cadet corps is talking about you right now. I figured. Dina came to stand beside her. She was eating something from a paper wrapper, some kind of granola bar, crumbling at the edge. Vance's company is saying you cheated. I know. Did you? Mara looked at the steps across the quad. Priest said no. I didn't ask what Priest said. Dina folded the granola bar wrapper into a precise square with the methodical focus of someone who processed things with her hands. I asked what you think. Mara considered the question properly, the way it deserved. I used what was available in the documented environment, she said finally. I didn't lie. I didn't damage anything. I didn't impersonate command. I introduced a delay using valid protocol in an ambiguous channel situation. If the rules had been clearer, I would have found a different angle. That's a very technical answer. It's a technical question. Dina looked at her. The afternoon light was doing something to the shadows across the quad, making the marble steps look almost golden. Marsh said he saw you in the common room last night until almost 0200 reading the exercise manual. Marsh should sleep more. Marsh said nobody else read past the first 50 pages. I know. Why did you read all of it? Mara was quiet for a moment. A cadet group was crossing the quad below, moving in the loose formation of people who'd just come from something structured and hadn't yet shed the shape of it. Because I don't have the other advantages, she said. I don't have the connections Vance has. I don't have his equipment or his team or his social credit in this building. What I have is time and the ability to read what other people don't bother to read. She paused. So I read. Dina was quiet for a bit, folding and unfolding the granola bar wrapper. She said, in the way that people say it when they've received information that requires some internal rearranging. They stood there in the afternoon quiet. Then Dina said, your cheek looks terrible, by the way. I know. The bruising's going to be worse tomorrow. I know that too. The next 3 days at Ironcrest had the particular quality of a shifted center of gravity, everything moving in the same directions as before, but slightly off the axis people were accustomed to. Mara felt it in the way conversation stopped a half-beat early when she entered a room, and in the way instructors called on her slightly more often than the randomness of a 20-person class could account for, and in the way Vance's company cadets arranged themselves in physical space relative to her position in any shared environment. None of it was dramatic. That was the nature of this kind of shift. The dramatic version, direct confrontation, explicit hierarchy challenge, would have been easier to navigate. This was subtler, which meant more sustained. She kept her pattern. Early mornings in the East Common Room with the curriculum materials. Consistent midfield performance in the physical assessments, not trailing, not leading, maintaining the comfortable middle that attracted the least observation. Precise, concise contributions in class discussions, limited to once or twice per session. She ate alone most mornings, which was her preference, and alone most evenings, which was simply how things had sorted. Dina occasionally appeared at her table with her granola bars and her single-syllable communication style, and they ate in what Mara considered a perfectly functional silence. On day 5, she was pulled from afternoon PT for a meeting she hadn't been told about. The summons came through Sergeant First Class Decker, who found her at the equipment return station after a land navigation practicum and said, "General Thorne." His office. Now. Without additional context, because Decker had apparently decided that additional context was not his department. She signed back her navigation kit and followed him. Thorne's office was on the 3rd floor of the main administrative building, not the showy corner office that Academy generals were traditionally assigned, but a smaller room on the interior with 2 windows looking onto an airshaft and walls lined with operational maps that were old enough to have physical pin holes in them from previous exercises. There was a desk with actual paperwork on it, not tablets, not screens, physical stacks of papers with handwritten annotations in the margins. A man who still used a red pen on physical documents was communicating something about himself, whether he meant to or not. He was standing when she came in, not sitting, which meant this wasn't going to be a long meeting. "Close the door," he said. She did. "Sit down." He gestured at the chair across the desk and then didn't sit himself, which created a slightly uncomfortable spatial dynamic that Mara recognized as deliberate. He moved to the window and looked at the airshaft, hands at his back. "I made inquiries," he said, "about your background." She waited. "Your academic record is complete. Your admission file is complete. Your personal history documentation is complete." He turned from the window. "It's also the most precisely average set of documents I've seen in 31 years in this institution." He paused. "Everything exactly unremarkable. Nothing below adequate, nothing above average. No holes in the record, no anomalies." He sat down. "Which is itself an anomaly." Mara looked at him without expression. "Most people who are genuinely average have 1 or 2 things that don't fit," he said. "A subject they're unusually bad at. A period of their record that's thin. Real averageness is uneven. It has texture." He picked up a pen and set it down again, the small physical tick of a man choosing words carefully. "Your record doesn't have texture. It has precision, which suggests someone put care into making it look like no care was taken." She said nothing. "I've also been told," he continued, "that you have a sealed file category on the admissions system, which requires a higher access tier than my standard administrative clearance to open." A beat. "I want to know what's in it," he said. "And I'm asking you directly before I go through formal channels, because I think the formal channel process will be slow and complicated, and I prefer direct." He looked at her steadily. "So, what am I missing, Cadet Quinn?" Mara held the look for 3 seconds. Then she said, "I'm not authorized to discuss the content of sealed administrative records, sir. I'm a general. I understand, sir. The authorization level is above Academy command structure. The silence that followed had a specific density to it. Thorne was a man who had spent his career in an institution where rank and authorization level were effectively the same thing, and being told that his rank did not grant him access to something inside his own academy was producing a visible, controlled reaction. Above Academy command, he repeated. Yes, sir. Joint command level? DOD? She said nothing, which was its own kind of answer, and she knew he understood that. He was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the operational maps on his wall. He looked at his desk. He looked at her. How old are you? He said finally, and it came out sounding less like a security question and more like something personal. 28, sir. He processed this. Most scholarship 3s are 22, 23. Yes, sir. What did you do between 22 and 28? I'm not able to discuss that, sir. He nodded. Slowly, the nod of a man filing something carefully. Then he said, You're here for a reason that isn't the stated reason. It was not a question. She didn't answer it as one. The exercise, he said. Your performance. You weren't trying to win the Black Meridian Exercise. You were doing something else. I was trying to complete the exercise, sir. You were assessing something. His voice was even and certain. I've watched cadets for 31 years. I've seen talented cadets. I've seen exceptional cadets. I've never watched a cadet manage a tactical environment the way you managed it, and then spend 40 minutes making sure their name stayed off the visible action. You fed information to other elements. You didn't lead. You stayed underground literally. He leaned forward slightly. That's not ambition. That's observation. You were watching how this place operates under pressure. The airshaft outside the window carried the sound of a distant equipment vehicle moving through the service road. In the room, the silence between them was the kind that comes when someone has said something accurate out loud in a space where accuracy is not the common currency. Mara said, I think the exercise was a useful training scenario, sir. Thorne looked at her for a long moment. Then he exhaled, not dramatically, just the small release of a man who has encountered a wall that isn't going to move right now. Dismissed, he said. She stood, squared her uniform, and moved to the door. Her hand was on the handle when he spoke again. Cadet Quinn. She stopped. The Ironcrest steps, he said. Day 1. You fell. Yes, sir. You didn't report it. It wasn't a reportable incident, sir. He was quiet. Then, Vance clipped you. I'm not able to confirm the cause of an accidental fall, sir. Another pause. Longer. No, I don't suppose you are. His voice had something in it that she couldn't place exactly, not sympathy, something more complicated than that. Get out of here. She left. In the stairwell on the way down, she stopped up on the second-floor landing and stood for a moment with her hand on the iron railing, the building quiet around her. Her ankle was aching. She'd been on it for 11 hours today, and the tape was losing its compression. She shifted her weight and let the railing take some of it and breathed in the dry institutional air of a building that had held the same kinds of ambitions and the same kinds of cruelties and rejections without quite managing to reconcile them. Thorne knew she wasn't what she appeared to be. He didn't know what she actually was. He would make inquiries through formal channels, which would take time and produce responses that told him less than he wanted. What he would find if he got far enough into the right filing systems would not be cadet records. And the question of what he would do with that information was one she didn't have an answer to yet. She started moving again, down the stairs, through the lobby, out into the early evening, where the academy grounds were settling into the quieter rhythms of the dinner hour, and the lights in the east dormitory block were coming on one by one in the windows, above the two tall marble steps. On the far side of the quad, she could see a cluster of Red Company cadets moving toward the mess hall, Vance among them, his posture doing what his posture always did, ownership of whatever space he was in, unquestioned and unreflective. He didn't see her, or if he saw her, he didn't acknowledge it. which was a version of the same thing. She watched him for a moment. Then she turned toward the East dormitory. She had reading to do. The Academy's institutional culture assessment parameters, the ones she'd been briefed on, before her enrollment, in a room she wasn't supposed to discuss, by people whose names weren't in any of her documentation, had specified that the observation period was 30 days. She was on day 5. 25 days was a long time. Long enough for people to show you things they didn't know they were showing. And something in the air tonight, in the tilt of Thorne's careful questions, in the too precise way Vance had asked, "Where did you learn to read a room like that?" In the fact that Decker had started noting her name in reports she technically shouldn't have known about, told her that the next 25 days were not going to look anything like the first 5. She pushed open the East dormitory door and started up the interior stairs. Behind her, across the quad, a light came on in the 3rd floor administrative wing. Thorne's office. He was back at his desk, and he was making phone calls, and somewhere at the other end of whatever chain he'd just started pulling, something was beginning to move. The light in Thorne's office stayed on past midnight. Mara knew this because she checked from her window at 2,300 and again at 100 when she woke from a shallow sleep with the particular alertness that wasn't quite anxiety, but occupied the same neighborhood. The 3rd floor administrative wing across the quad was mostly dark, except for 2 windows, a cleaning crew working the east corridor, and Thorne's office, where the light had the steady quality of someone still at their desk, rather than the intermittent quality of someone moving around a room. She lay back on her bunk and looked at the ceiling and listened to the radiator knock. Whatever he was pulling on, it had threads. That much she'd expected. The question was how far those threads went before they hit something that required a different kind of authorization, and what Thorne did when he reached that wall. Some generals pushed. Some generals noted the wall and filed a report. Some generals got creative. Thorne, based on 31 years of institutional record and the particular quality of his questions this evening, was the kind who pushed. She slept for 4 hours and was up before the east. Dormitory stirred, dressed in the dark, with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to do everything quietly in spaces where sound carried. Day 6 began with a 600 formation that Mara attended in the middle of Blue Company's assembly block, which was where she always stood, middle rank, middle position, the coordinates of someone trying not to be noticed. This had been her approach since day 1, and she saw no reason to change it now. The fact that it was no longer working quite as intended, that her name and her face had achieved a level of recognition in the cadet corps that her first 5 days had carefully avoided, was an operational complication, not a reason to shift behavior. The formation briefing was routine, physical training schedule, afternoon class assignments, a reminder about the upcoming leadership evaluation series, which was a 3-day assessment block beginning on day 12 that every first-year cadet was required to complete. Standard stuff. Then Lieutenant Colonel Priest stepped forward and added one item that wasn't on the distributed schedule. Additionally, starting day 8, the Academy will be hosting an external oversight assessment from Joint Command's Institutional Standards Division. This is a scheduled review the Academy undergoes one every 4 years. The ISD team will be embedded for 10 days. They'll observe training operations, conduct interviews with cadets and instructors, and review administrative processes. He paused. I want to be clear that this review is routine and procedural. Carry on as normal. The way he said carry on as normal had exactly the tone of a man who very much hoped people would and wasn't quite sure they would. Mara filed this. Beside her, Park muttered under his breath, ISDD. That's internal affairs for military academies. I know, Mara said very quietly. You know everything, he muttered, and didn't say it unkindly. After formation, Mara took her standard route to the morning meal east corridor, down the interior stairs, through the lobby, into the mess hall via the side entrance, and she was 3 steps from the side entrance when Vance came around the corner from the opposite direction and nearly walked into her. They both stopped. The hallway was narrow. 2 people stopping in it created an unavoidable proximity. Vance had 2 cadets with him, the one with the watchful eyes, whose name she'd since learned was Sergeant Cadets Reeves, and a larger cadet named Dahl, who had the physical presence of someone who had been told his whole life that his size was his most useful quality. Vance looked at her. She looked at him. The second stretched. "Quinn," he said, "cadet captain." He didn't move to let her pass and didn't move to go around her, which meant they were having a conversation whether she wanted to or not. She waited. "ISD assessment," he said. "You hear the brief?" "Yes. Convenient timing." She kept her expression level. "Priest said it's scheduled every 4 years. Priest says a lot of things." He shifted his weight slightly, the subtle repositioning of someone choosing how to approach the next sentence. "My father served on an ISD review panel 12 years ago. He told me they don't show up on schedule when everything is fine. They show up on schedule when someone's given them a reason to prioritize the scheduled visit." Mara said nothing. "Someone," Vance said, and the word had a careful, deliberate quality, filed a preliminary concern report, which triggers a mandatory site assessment within 30 days. And we're currently, he did the math visibly, 26 days out from the Black Meridian Exercise. She looked at him. "I'm a first-year scholarship cadet captain. I don't have access to Joint Command Concern report channels." "No," he said, "but someone who has access to sealed admissions files might." The hallway was very quiet. Reeves, to Vance's left, was watching this exchange with the watchful eye expression she'd catalogued on day 3. Dahl was looking at a point approximately 6 inches above Mara's head, which was his way of being present without being involved. "I don't know what's in my admissions file," Mara said. "Files of that category are sealed to the individual." "Sure." He nodded. "Of course." He stepped to the side finally, giving her room to pass, and as she moved by him, he said, without raising his voice, "The ISD team is going to interview cadets. Individually. On record." He paused. "I'd think carefully about what you say." She stopped. She turned and looked at him over her shoulder, and she held the look for 3 seconds. "I always do," she said. She went through the side entrance into the mess hall. Days 6 and 7 had the compressed, slightly airless quality of a period between events. Everyone aware that something had been set in motion. Nobody able to fully articulate what. The ISD announcement had moved through the cadet corps with the speed that significant institutional information always moved, which was faster than official channels and filtered through the distortion of 60 different people's interpretations. By the end of day 6, the version circulating among junior cadets was that the ISD was coming because of the Black Meridian Exercise specifically. By morning of day 7, a competing version said it was a routine visit that had nothing to do with the exercise, and people were overreacting. Mara knew which version was true and didn't engage with either. She spent day 7's free period in the Academy Library, physical library, taught not the digital terminals, because the physical stacks in the northeast corner of the 3rd floor had a reading alcove behind the doctrine and strategy section that was invisible from the entrance and from the floor supervisors' desks. She sat in this alcove with 2 documents. She sat in the alcove with 2 documents that were publicly available to any enrolled cadet through the Academy's administrative portal and the Joint Command Institutional Standards Division Assessment Criteria Framework. She read the ISD framework twice. The assessment criteria covered 13 categories. Categories 1 through 7 were operational training program design, equipment standards, physical readiness benchmarks, that sort of thing. Categories 8 through 13 were cultural and administrative, leadership conduct standards, cadet welfare policies, reporting mechanisms for misconduct, accountability processes, and something listed as institutional climate assessment, which was the ISD's formal term for the question of whether the culture inside the walls matched the values stated on the walls. Category 13 had a subsection she read carefully. It outlined the evidentiary standards for what the framework called systemic conduct deficiencies, patterns of behavior that a single incident might not capture, but that repeated observation, multiple reporting sources, and documented precedent could establish. The subsection specified that ISD teams were empowered to classify a systemic conduct deficiency as an institutional finding, which triggered a remediation mandate requiring specific corrective actions within 90 days. She closed the document and sat in the alcove for a while, looking at the doctrine shelves in front of her. The sounds of the library filtered through the stacks, the low conversation of cadets at the study tables, the periodic clunk of the door mechanism, the scratch of pen on paper from somewhere nearby. She pulled out her small notebook, the one with the reflective back cover, and wrote 3 words. Then she looked at what she'd written for a moment and closed the notebook and put it back in her cargo pocket. The ISD team arrived on day 8 at 900 in 2 unmarked vehicles that were conspicuously not trying to look like anything in particular. There were 5 of them, a lead assessor, 2 junior assessors, 2 junior assessors, an administrative specialist, and a 4th person whose role wasn't listed on the official team manifest that the Academy's admin office circulated. The 4th person was a compact woman in civilian clothes who moved through the building with the unhurried situational awareness of someone who had done this before in places less comfortable than a military academy. Mara clocked her on the first pass through the main hall and noted her twice more during the day. Once near the operations room during the afternoon training block, once in the east corridor at an angle that gave a clear sight line to the scholarship cadet dormitory wing. On day 9, Mara received a schedule notification on her academy tablet informing her that she had an ISD interview appointment at 1400 in the secondary conference room on the administrative floor. She arrived 4 minutes early. The interviewer was one of the junior assessors, a composed man in his mid-40s named Castillo, according to the name placard he'd placed on the table, who had the deliberate neutral quality of someone trained to make rooms feel safe for candid conversation. He offered her water. She declined. He started the recording device visible, which was required by the visible not hidden, which assessment protocol, and stated the standard opening that confirmed this was a voluntary interview and that she could stop at any point. Then he asked her, in a friendly and open-ended way, how she was finding her first weeks at the academy. She told him it was a rigorous program, and she was learning a great deal. She told him the instructors were highly competent. She told him the facilities were well maintained. He asked her about her experience with the cadet leadership structure. She told him the leadership cadets demonstrated strong technical skills. She told him the hierarchy was clearly communicated. He asked her, with the same open expression, whether she'd experienced or observed any conduct that concerned her. She looked at him steadily and said, "Can you be more specific about what category of conduct you mean?" He could. He was specific. He used the language of the assessment framework, leadership conduct standards, cadet welfare, reporting mechanisms, and he watched her with the practiced attention of someone who understood that what people didn't say was at least as significant as what they did. She answered each specific question specifically. She did not volunteer. She did not editorialize. She described what she had directly observed, the land navigation debrief. On day 2, the comment and the tone, Okafor's response, the instructor reactions. She described day 1 on the Ironcrest steps in precise physical terms, the contact, the fall, the blood, the response. She did not attribute intent. She stated observable fact. Castillo wrote notes. His expression didn't change, which was the correct professional response, and also told her he'd heard at least some version of some of this already. At the end, he asked, "Is there anything else you'd like to share?" She said, "I'd like to note that Cadet Captain Vance is a tactically skilled cadet. I want to be clear about that. Steele looked at her. Noted, he said, and she could see him processing the fact that she'd volunteered this information, and why. She thanked him and left. The leadership evaluation series began on day 12 as scheduled, a 3-day block that took every first-year cadet through a rotating series of assessed scenarios, command decisions under pressure, resource allocation exercises, interpersonal conflict resolution simulations. The scenarios were designed to surface leadership behavior in conditions where cadets couldn't rely on technical knowledge alone. Mara had been assigned to a 6-person evaluation group that included, by the scheduling algorithm, or by something less random that she couldn't confirm, both Park and Cadet Sergeant Reeves. Reeves being in her group was the interesting element. He was Vance's man, the watchful-eyed one who'd been at Vance's shoulder through every notable interaction, and being placed in a shared evaluation environment with him meant 12 hours of close observation, running in both directions. She decided this was probably not accidental. The first scenario was a resource allocation problem. 6 cadets, 1 vehicle with a damaged axle, a simulated casualty who needed evacuation, and a set of competing priority tasks with a 40-minute window. The group's nominated leader for the first rotation was a cadet named Vasquez, who was technically solid but made the kind of confident decisions that skipped the step of checking whether the confidence was warranted. Mara took the position at the back of the group and watched. The casualty evacuation became the dominant priority, which was correct. Where Vasquez's plan started compressing was in the vehicle repair timeline. He assigned 2 people to fix the axle using a repair kit that Mara had already determined from a 30-second assessment of the simulated components was missing 2 necessary fasteners. The kit looked complete. It wasn't. Nobody else had checked it. She watched the repair team work for 4 minutes before the scenario evaluator noted a timing alert. Then she said, from the back, Vasquez, the repair kit is short 2 grade 8 bolts. The axle repair isn't viable on the current timeline. Vasquez turned. What? Front pocket of the kit. Should be 4 bolts, there are 2. Without them, the axle torque spec can't be met, and the vehicle's not safe for casualty transport. He stared at her. How do you... I checked it when we started. She kept her voice flat and practical. New timeline, the vehicle's not usable. We need to reconfigure for a foot evacuation and split the remaining tasks between 2 teams. A 2-second pause that felt longer. Then Vasquez said, okay, reroute, and the group shifted, and the scenario resolved within the window. In the evaluator's notes that Mara wasn't supposed to see, but could read at an angle from her position in the post-scenario circle, the assessor had written unsolicited critical observation, technically accurate, delivered without disrupting command structure. Timed intervention. Beside her, Reeves was looking at his own hands with the expression of someone processing something privately. At the water break between scenarios, he appeared beside her at the hydration station. He filled a cup. He didn't look at her. The bolt thing, he said. Yes. You checked the kit when we walked in. Yes. He drank his water. Vance would have done the same thing. He just would have said it differently. She looked at him. How would he have said it? Reeves considered. This kit is garbage. Who prepped this scenario and then fixed it? He paused. Same result. Different damage. She thought about that. That's an honest assessment. He's not a bad tactician, Reeves said. It came out sounding like something he'd been carrying for a while and was choosing, now, specifically, to put down. He doesn't know what he does to people. Or he knows and he's decided it doesn't matter. I'm not sure which one is worse. She said nothing. This was not the moment to agree or disagree. Reeves threw his cup in the waste bin. He told me you'd try to use the ISD assessment against him. Did he? He told me to watch what you said in the evaluation scenarios. Report back. He paused. I'm not going to do that. She kept her expression level. That's your call, Cadet Sergeant. Yeah, he said. It is. He moved back toward the group. Mara watched him go and thought that whatever Reeves was doing, weighing something, sorting something, it was genuine. And genuine things were always more unpredictable than performed things. Day 13 arrived with a cold front that pushed wet air through every gap in the East Dormitory's aging window frames and made the radiator work harder, which meant it knocked louder, which meant Mara was awake at 230, lying in the dark, listening to it, while Dina slept through everything with the profound indifference of someone who had achieved complete sensory domestication of institutional noise. At 310, her Academy tablet lit up with a message notification. She read it in the dark, screen brightness at minimum. The message was from the Academy Administrative System Automated Format, official header. It informed her that effective the following morning, she was being transferred from Blue Company to Red Company pending a Leadership Evaluation Series reassessment. The transfer was authorized by the Commandant's Office under the Adaptive Placement Protocol, which allowed first-year cadets to be reassigned mid-cycle if their evaluation performance indicated placement mismatch. She read it twice. Then she set the tablet face down on her chest and looked at the ceiling and ran through the implications with the same methodical focus she brought to everything else. Red Company, Vance's company, assigned to operate inside his command structure, his direct leadership authority, in the middle of an ISD assessment period, while Thorne's inquiries about her background were working their way through whatever channels he'd accessed. The adaptive placement protocol was real. She'd read it in the Academy charter. It was rarely used. The criteria for triggering it were subjective enough that the Commandant's office had significant discretion in when to apply it. She thought about Vance's father and the ISD review panels. She thought about Thorne's light on at midnight. She thought about the 4th ISD team member in civilian clothes, who'd been watching the dormitory wing. She thought about the fact that whoever had authorized this transfer had done it at 300, which was not when routine administrative decisions were made. The ceiling said nothing useful. She put the tablet on her footlocker and went back to lying still, and she didn't sleep, and she didn't panic, because panicking had never once in her experience changed the shape of a problem. At 530, she dressed, packed her issued gear, and stood in the dormitory room with her rucksack and her helmet bag and the familiar weight of everything she'd brought in. Dina was awake. She woke when the rucksack clasp clicked, because whatever Dina's relationship was with external noise, she was apparently a light sleeper at close range. She sat up and looked at Mara. She took in the packed gear. Red Company, Mara said. Dina looked at her for a moment. That's Vance's company. I know. Is that... She stopped. She tried again. Are you going to be okay? Mara thought about how to answer that honestly. Probably, she said. It might get complicated first. Dina nodded, the single nod of someone who had decided to trust an answer without demanding clarification. Okay. She lay back down. Then, toward the ceiling, the periodic table if you want it. Mara almost smiled. I'm fine. Thanks. She picked up her gear and left. Red Company's assembly point was on the west side of the training grounds, which was a better maintained facility than the east side. In the small but consistent ways that reflected institutional priority, newer equipment lockers, a functioning weight room, better lighting in the briefing space. Mara arrived at 545 and found the company already in loose preformation clusters. And the moment she came through the gate, she felt the shift in the air the same way she'd felt it in the operations. Room debriefed the particular quality of attention that gathered when something unexpected entered a known space. Vance was standing at the far end of the assembly area with Dahl and 2 other senior cadets. He saw her immediately. His face did something fast and controlled and then settled. She crossed the assembly area and stopped at the correct reporting distance. Cadet Quinn, reporting for Red Company assignment, for Adaptive Placement Protocol, Cadet Captain. He looked at her. I know who you are. Yes, sir. A beat. Who authorized the transfer? Commandant's office, sir. The notification came through administrative channels at 310. Something moved through his expression. He hadn't known. She could see it the micro-adjustment of a man who had just received information that changed his map of the situation. He looked at her with a new quality of attention, one that was trying to solve the same problem she'd been lying awake, solving at 300. 310, he said. Yes, sir. Middle of the night. Yes, sir. He looked at her for 3 more seconds. Then, fall in with second element. Sergeant Reeves will show you your rack assignment. Yes, sir. She moved. Behind her, she heard him say something quiet to Doll, too low to catch, and Doll's single-syllable response. Reeves was waiting at the second element marker with the expression of someone who had known she was coming, which meant either the transfer notification had gone to element leaders as well, or Reeves was better at reading situations than his rank suggested. She suspected both. Quinn, he said. Reeves. He looked at her gear, then at her face. You sleep? Some. He nodded. Processing something. Then, Sextant rack. East side. Lockers already tagged. He started moving and she fell into step beside him. You know what this is, he said. Not a question. I have theories. Vance didn't request the transfer. He said it at low volume, not looking at her. I'm telling you that directly. He didn't know. I believe you. Which means someone else moved you here. He glanced at her. And they didn't feel the need to tell the company commander his roster was changing overnight. No, that's not normal. No, she said again. It isn't. They reached the billet area, and he stopped at the second rack, east side, as described. He stood there for a moment after she set her gear down, and she could see him making a decision. Vance is going to put you in a scenario today, Reeves said. Leadership eval rotation. He's going to give you the worst position, and watch what you do with it. She looked at him. Why are you telling me this? He shrugged. The one-shoulder shrug of someone who had run out of complicated explanations and was going with the simple one. Because it's the right thing to do. He paused. And because I've been watching you for 8 days and I'm tired of pretending I can't see what I'm looking at. She absorbed this. What are you looking at? He held her gaze for 2 seconds. I don't know exactly. But whatever it is, it didn't come from any cadet academy. He turned and walked away before she could respond. Mara set her rucksack on the rack and looked at the billet ceiling lower than the east dormitory, institutional badge, water stain, in the northwest corner. She was inside Vance's operational space now, in his company, under his direct authority, during an ISD assessment, while Thorne's phone calls moved through the system and the unnamed civilian woman in plain clothes watched the academy's hallways. The scenario Reeves was describing, the one Vance was going to run, was a leadership evaluation series module. Formal observed on the record. Everything that happened in it would be documented. She thought about that and about the assessment criteria framework and about Category 13 and the subsection on systemic conduct deficiencies. Then she heard Vance's voice carry across the assembly area, crisp, authoritative, the voice of a man entirely in his element calling formation. She squared her rack and walked out. The leadership evaluation scenario ran at 1,100 in the full-scale tactical operations room, a high-tech simulation space with overhead projection, positional tracking, and enough processing power to run a real-time battlefield model. The scenario assigned to the Red Company evaluation block was a crisis command problem, a simulated infrastructure failure in an active combat zone requiring the assigned commander to manage 3 simultaneous task groups under degraded communications, civilian presence complications, and a cascading timeline. The rotation structure gave each cadet a leadership position for a 20-minute window. The evaluators assigned the roles. Mara watched the first 3 rotations from the observer position, tracking the scenario's architecture, how the communications degradation was structured, which task group had the resource deficit, where the civilian presence variables were introduced, and at what timing intervals. When the fourth rotation came, the evaluator called the assignments. Task Group Alpha Command Reeves. Task Group Bravo Support Dahl. Task Group Charlie, the civilian management element, the most ambiguous and least resourced of the three positions. The one that required the most improvisational judgment and offered the least clear path to measurable success. Task Group Charlie lead, the evaluator said. Quinn. From across the room, Vance watched her move to the Charlie position with the stillness of someone who had gotten exactly what he arranged for and was now watching to see what it produced. She stood at the Charlie station and looked at the operational display in front of her. The civilian presence variable was a simulated population center, 300 civilians, mixed mobility, 2 access routes, 1 compromised. Her task group had 4 personnel, 2 operable transport units, and a communication setup that was running on the scenario's degraded channel, which meant every transmission had a simulated delay and a 15% signal loss rate. She had 20 minutes. She keyed her radio. Charlie Element, this is Quinn. I need a head count on transport capacity, and I need it in the next 90 seconds. Her element, 4 cadets, she'd been in the same building with for 13 days, but had never operated. Beside, looked at her with varying degrees of attention and got to work. She looked at the display. She looked at the 2 access routes. She looked at the timing intervals on the civilian presence variable and identified the pattern, not random, sequenced, based on a population movement model that had a predictable peak at minute 9 and a secondary peak at minute 16. She started talking. Not fast, controlled, specific, no wasted words. Task Group Charlie wasn't going to evacuate 300 simulated civilians in 20 minutes. That was the design of the position. But Task Group Charlie could establish a priority sequencing that reduced the critical population's exposure by a calculable margin, and it could do it in a way that freed Alpha and Bravo's resources at minute 12, which was when both of those elements hit their own resource, compression points. This civilian management problem, in other words, was actually a resource optimization problem for the entire scenario if you read it correctly, which required reading the other 2 task groups' timelines as well as your own. She'd been reading them for the last 40 minutes from the observer position. At minute 7, she sent a transmission to Reeves. Alpha, Charlie element, can absorb your civilian overflow, starting minute 12. I need your transport unit for 90 seconds at that point to complete the priority sequencing. A pause. Then Reeves, that's outside the Charlie mandate. It's within the scenario parameters. I need 90 seconds of your transport. Another pause. Confirmed. At minute 12, the Charlie element sequencing clicked into the gap in Alpha's resource compression, exactly as she'd calculated, and the transport unit moved, and the priority population cleared its exposure window, and Reeves's Alpha element had its resources freed up 17 seconds ahead of the timeline it had been running on. At minute 19, the evaluator called the rotation end. The room was quiet for a moment after the simulation ended. Thorne's voice came from the back of the room. She hadn't known he was there. She turned with the rest of the room. He was standing at the rear observer position with the unnamed civilian woman beside him. The one in plain clothes who'd been watching the dormitory wing, and beside her was a man Mara had not seen before at the academy. Tall, mid-50s, the particular carriage of someone who hadn't worn a uniform in years, but had worn one for a long time. No name tag, no academy identification. Thorne looked at Mara. Then he looked at the evaluators. Then he looked at Vance. Clear the room, he said. Evaluation cadets, hold in the corridor. Instructors, remain. The cadets moved. Reeves passed Mara at the door and didn't speak, but the look on his face said something she'd need to think about later. She was 4 steps into the corridor when Thorne said, Quinn, stay. She stopped. She turned back. The room was emptying, cadets filing out around her, and then it was Thorne and the evaluators and the civilian woman and the man with no name tag and across the room, stopped in the same motion she was, still in the room, because he'd also been told to stay Vance. He looked at her. She looked at him. The unnamed man walked to the center of the room and set a tablet on the nearest table. He turned it to face outward. On its screen was a document header that both she and the room could read from here. It read, Nightglass Group Classified Personnel File. And below it, a name. Her name. The air in the room had a specific quality now, the stillness that came before something broke. Thorne looked at her. Major Quinn, he said. Not cadet. Not Scholarship 3. Major. The word landed in the room and stayed there. Nobody moved. That was the first thing, the complete physical stillness of everyone in the room in the 2 seconds after Thorne said the word major. The evaluators, the unnamed man, the civilian woman, and Vance, standing 12 feet to Mara's left with his arms at his sides and his face doing something she'd never seen it do before, which was nothing at all. No performance, no calibration. Just the blank expression of someone whose map of the situation had just been pulled out from under them. Mara looked at Thorne, then at the tablet on the table, then at the unnamed man who had placed it there. Sir, she said, this room isn't cleared for nightglass material. The unnamed man looked at her. He had gray eyes, and the particular patience of someone accustomed to being the most senior person present without needing to say so. The room is cleared, Major. I cleared it before we came in. She processed this. The evaluators in the room, she looked at them again, with this new information and reassessed. The way they were standing, the way none of them had reacted to the tablet reveal, with the surprise that actual academy evaluators would have shown. You're not evaluators, she said. We're conducting an evaluation, the man said. The subject and the scope are different from what was on the schedule. Vance made a sound, not a word, the involuntary sound of someone whose processing had hit a wall. What the hell is happening? Thorne looked at him. Cadet Captain, I'll ask you to hold your questions. With respect, General, you just called my newest assignment a major and pulled up a classified file in my company's evaluation room. So I think I'm entitled to minus. You're entitled to what I authorize you to be entitled to. Thorne's voice didn't go hard. It just stopped having room in it for negotiation. Stand fast. Vance stood fast. His jaw was set and his hands were at his sides, and he was doing the thing he did when he was controlling something. But what he was controlling right now was himself, and it was costing him more than it usually did. The unnamed man picked up the tablet and held it in a way that kept the screen visible. Major Quinn, I'm Director Harlan Sowe. I run operational placement for the Nightglass Group. You know who I am? She did. She'd never met him in person, but she knew the name and the role and the fact that 3 people in her previous operational life had referred to him exclusively as the director and never by name. Yes, sir, she said. Your cover is officially lifted as of 13 minutes ago. Authorization came from Joint Command, countersigned by DoD Civilian Oversight. The Academy's ISD assessment team has been briefed. He set the tablet down. We need to have a conversation that should have happened in a different room. But given the timeline and what's developed in the last 72 hours, I'm making a judgment call to have it here. He looked at her steadily. Do you understand? Yes, sir. Good. He pulled out a chair from the nearest table, reversed it, and sat with his arms across the back in the unself-conscious way of someone who had stopped performing authority long ago because they no longer needed to. Tell me what you found. The debrief that followed lasted 47 minutes and was one of the stranger experiences of Mara's professional life, which had included several experiences that qualified as genuinely strange. She stood. So sat. Thorne stood to the left near the operational display. The civilian woman whose name Mara learned in the first 3 minutes was Deputy Assessor Carla Fennick, the ISD team's lead on institutional climate, sat at the table with a recording device and a legal pad. The fake evaluators arranged themselves around the room in positions that Mara recognized as witness placement, not audience seating. and Vance stood against the far wall, with his arms crossed and his face very still, because no one had told him to leave, which meant he was here intentionally, which was information she filed. The assessment mission, Soe said. Walk me through what you observed. She organized it cleanly and delivered it without editorializing. 13 days of observation. She covered the Ironcrest Steps incident date, time, contact, observable evidence, the absence of reporting from any party, including herself. She covered the land navigation debrief and Vance's comment to Okafor. She covered the 3 instances in the first week where she had observed junior cadets modifying their behavior in Vance's presence in ways consistent with a coercive social environment. Not dramatic, not individually conclusive, but documented and patterned. She covered the overnight transfer to Red Company, which she said she had not requested and which she'd received no official explanation for. She covered Vance's corridor conversation with her 2 days ago. I'd think carefully about what you say and delivered it as a direct quote with the date and location. She covered everything in precise sequence, and she watched Fennec's pen move steadily across the legal pad. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. So looked at Vance. You want to respond to any of that? Vance uncrossed his arms. He looked at the floor for a moment, then at Soe, then at Mara. Whatever was happening in his expression was too complex to read quickly. The steps. I clipped her heel. I didn't report it. A pause. I didn't think it was worth reporting. You didn't think a first-year cadet going down on stairs and cutting her face open was worth reporting, Fennec said. Not a question. Her voice was flat and technical. It was an accident. The investigation will determine that. Vance looked at her. Investigation. The ISD assessment has enough documented material to open a formal conduct inquiry. That process started this morning. Fennec looked at her notes. The Okafor incident. 2 other reports from junior cadets that were filed anonymously through the ISD's confidential channel during the first 48 hours of the assessment period. She paused. You have a pattern, Cadet Captain. This isn't about one incident. The color in Vance's face changed. Not dramatically, a slight tightening, a slight draining. He looked at Thorne. Sir, I want to state for the record that I didn't arrange the overnight transfer. I didn't know about it before it happened. I believe you, Thorne said. Then who? The Commandant's office. Thorne's voice was even. Acting on a recommendation from my office, acting on the preliminary ISD assessment findings, acting on my own administrative authority. He paused. Placing you inside Red Company's operational structure was a deliberate decision to observe how you exercised authority when you believed there was no institutional scrutiny. He let that sit. There was institutional scrutiny. The evaluation team observed your leadership evaluation scenario assignment. They observed the position you gave Cadet Quinn. They observed your conduct in this room 10 minutes ago. Vance stood there. Something was happening in his face that Mara had not seen before, not the controlled performance of a man managing his image, but the raw process of a man whose understanding of his own situation was being rebuilt, piece by piece, with worse materials than he'd started with. Major Quinn was assessing the academy, he said, not as a challenge, as a statement of someone laying out what they now understood. Correct, Soe said. For how long? The placement was authorized for 30 days. She's on day 13. A long pause. The Black Meridian Exercise. Was that part of the assessment? Mara answered this one, because it was her assessment. No. The exercise was a genuine training scenario. I operated within it, because I was in it. She paused. But yes, it produced observable data. About leadership culture. About what happens when someone unexpected performs well in a system that didn't account for them. Vance looked at her for a long moment. His jaw moved slightly, the micro-movement of someone choosing words carefully from a suddenly limited supply. And what happens, he said, according to your data? She held his gaze. The system tries to put them somewhere manageable. The room was very quiet. He looked down. then up. Then he looked at Thorne and said, "What happens now?" What happened now was a 3-hour process that felt simultaneously procedurally inevitable and operationally surreal. So and Fennec moved to the administrative conference room on the second floor, taking the fake evaluators with them. Thorne stayed in the tactical operations room with Mara, and for reasons that Thorne explained with the brief efficiency of a man who had made the decision and didn't need to justify it extensively. Vance. He stays, Thorne said, because what happens in the next hour concerns him directly, and I don't believe in conducting consequential processes about people in their absence. Vance looked like he wasn't sure whether to be grateful for this or not. He sat down at the table with the posture of someone who had made the decision to hear what was coming rather than brace against it. That posture cost him something Mara could see it, and the fact that he'd chosen it rather than the alternatives said something she hadn't expected. Thorne sat. Mara sat across from him, Vance at the end, slightly apart. "The night glass group," Thorne said to her. "For the record. Covert Operations Unit under Joint Command's Special Activities Division," she said. "I've been with the group for 6 years. Specializations in infiltration, unconventional warfare intelligence assessment, and institutional evaluation." She paused. "Before that, I was an intelligence specialist with the 4th Ranger Support Battalion for 3 years. Before that, 2 years of standard enlisted service." Thorne looked at her. "You're 28. "Yes, sir." "I enlisted at 19. He processed the math, the academy placement. "Who initiated it?" "Joint Command's Institutional Health Division, in coordination with ISD. They identified Ironcrest as a priority assessment target based on 3 years of aggregate data retention rates, anonymous misconduct reports, pattern analysis of which cadets advanced through the leadership pipeline and which didn't, and the demographic breakdown of those patterns." She kept her voice level. "The data suggested the Academy's leadership culture had a structural problem that wasn't being captured by standard evaluations because the standard evaluation process was being conducted by the same institutional culture it was supposed to be assessing." Thorne was quiet for a moment. "You needed an outside observer who could operate inside the system. Someone who could pass as a cadet and who understood institutional cultures well enough to distinguish between surface compliance and genuine conduct." She paused. "The cover needed to be credible over 30 days. Scholarship 3 was the correct category. It placed me in the lowest status position in the cadet hierarchy, which is where the power dynamics are most visible. Average performance records. Yes, sir. Calibrated to be unremarkable." He nodded slowly, then he said, "The exercise. You didn't have to win." "No, sir. But you did." She considered how to answer this honestly. "The exercise put me in a position where the available data indicated a specific approach was viable. I used it." She paused. "I'm aware it accelerated the timeline." "It did." He looked at her. "It also made the conduct pattern that followed more visible than it would otherwise have been." Vance's response to the exercise result produced observable data. From the end of the table, Vance said, "You're talking about me like I'm not in the room." Thorne looked at him. "I'm talking about you like you're a subject of an institutional assessment, which you are. That's a different thing. A beat. What does that mean for me, specifically?" "It means the ISD investigation will run its course. It means there will be formal findings. It means those findings will determine what happens to your standing at this academy." Thorne's voice was even. He wasn't performing severity. He was being accurate. "I'll be honest with you, Vance. The individual incidents in your record are on the line. 1 or 2 of them, taken alone, might be categorized as leadership-style issues. The pattern across 13 days of documented observation is harder to defend." Vance put his hands flat on the table. He looked at them. He said, "I called her a ghost. On the steps." He didn't look up. "I knew she was going down. I kept walking. The room was quiet. I've been doing things like that," he said, "for 4 years. And nobody said anything that landed." Nobody made me sit in a room and hear it described like evidence. He stopped. Started again. I'm not saying it excuses anything. I'm saying I didn't understand what I was doing the way I understand it right now, in this room. Thorne looked at him for a long moment. Mara looked at her hands on the table. That understanding, Thorne said, is the beginning of something. It's not the end of a process. Vance nodded. He looked like he'd aged several years in the last 2 hours. Not dramatically, it was in the set of his shoulders and the absence of the performance that had been in every room she'd observed him in. What do I do, he said. It was the first time she'd heard him ask that, rather than state it. Thorne looked at him. You cooperate fully with the ISD inquiry. You tell them what you told me just now, on the record. You don't manage it and you don't minimize it. He paused. And then you wait for the findings. The afternoon broke into fragments. So found Mara in the corridor at 1600 and walked with her to the external quad, away from the building's interior acoustics. The sun had come through the morning's cloud cover, and the quad was washed in the pale gold of a late autumn afternoon, the Ironcrest steps across the way catching the light the way they always did. The mission runs to day 30, Soe said. Joint Command wants the full assessment period. I know. Thorne knows who you are now. The cover's lifted internally at the senior level. You'll continue as an enrolled cadet for the remainder of the period this assessment requires the continued observation. But, understood. He looked at her. How's the ankle? She hadn't mentioned the ankle in the debrief. Fine, sir. Decker's report noted you've been compensating your gait since day 1. He kept walking. Get it properly evaluated. Yes, sir. They reached the far side of the quad. He stopped and looked at the building. The ISD findings will take 60 to 90 days to formalize. Vance's case will be part of a broader institutional finding. The pattern is bigger than one cadet. The Academy's instructor accountability structure, the scholarship cadet placement policies, the conduct reporting mechanisms. He paused. Your assessment report will be the core evidentiary document. I understand. It needs to be thorough. It will be. He was quiet for a moment. You read the entire exercise manual the night before the exercise. Yes, sir, Decker told Thorne. Thorne told me. He glanced at her. You could have run this assessment at a significantly lower profile and produced the same evidentiary record. She knew where this was going. Yes, sir. Why didn't you? She thought about how to answer this, honestly, the same way she'd thought about Dina's question, about the manual. Because a low-profile assessment would have documented individual incidents. The exercise created a high-pressure moment that made the response pattern visible at a systemic level. She paused. Individual incidents can be dismissed as isolated. Systemic patterns are harder to argue away. Soe looked at her. You accelerated the timeline intentionally. I used the available environment to produce more useful data. By winning a simulation that Blue Company has never won. By reading the documentation that was available to everyone. He was quiet for a beat. That's a careful answer. It's the honest answer, sir. He looked at the building for a moment longer. Your next placement is already in queue. Different institutional context. We'll brief you at the end of the 30-day period. Yes, sir. He turned to go. Then he stopped. Quinn. She waited. The steps, he said. Day 1. You could have reported the incident immediately and accelerated the formal process by a week. Yes, sir. Why didn't you? She looked at the Ironcrest steps. Across the quad, the 2 tall risers, the iron railings, the marble that caught the afternoon light and made everything look more significant than stone had any right to look. Because a report on day 1 would have started a process, she said. And a process is managed. What I needed was a pattern. Patterns don't emerge from processes. They emerge from time. So looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, not the kind of nod that meant approval exactly, but the kind that meant understood, and walked back toward the administrative building. Reeves found her at 1730 near the equipment return station, where she was turning in her Red Company assignment. Kit, the transfer had been quietly reversed. Her placement returned to Blue Company, with a notation that the adaptive placement protocol had concluded its assessment phase, which was the kind of administrative language that said nothing specific and everything general. He came around the corner of the equipment cage and stopped when he saw her. He looked at the kit she was turning in. He looked at her face. "True or not true?" he said. "Not a full question." She looked at him. "Depends on what you're asking. You're not a cadet." She considered what she was now authorized to say. "I'm enrolled as a cadet. My assignment here is real." "That's not what I asked." She handed the kit across the counter to the equipment officer and waited for the receipt. Then she turned back to Reeves. "The things I told you about why I read the manual were true. The things I did in the Black Meridian Exercise were real decisions made in real time." She paused. "The background behind them is more complicated. He absorbed this in the careful way he absorbed most things. You were assessing the academy." She said nothing. "Vance?" he said. Still nothing. He looked at the Ironcrest building and then back at her. "He's not entirely what you think. There are reasons he is the way he is, and I'm not making excuses for it. But there's more behind it than just..." He stopped. "I'm saying it's not simple." "It never is," she said. "Are you going to? Is the report going to?" He couldn't find the end of the sentence. "The report documents what was observable," she said. "I documented what I saw. I noted his tactical ability clearly. I noted the specific incidents. I don't draw conclusions that go beyond the observable data." She looked at him. "The institution makes the conclusions." "That's not my role." He nodded slowly. A cadet group passed between them and the building, moving toward the mess hall, and neither of them spoke until the sound of their boots faded. "He asked me about you this afternoon," Reeves said. After the room. "He asked if I'd known." "What did you tell him?" "That I'd suspected something, but I didn't know what." He paused. He said he should have known too. That someone who read the whole manual the night before wasn't trying to pass the exercise. They were trying to understand the system. He looked at her. He said it like it made him angry. "But not at you." She heard this. "He's going to cooperate with the ISD inquiry," Reeves said. "He told me directly. He's going to tell them everything on the record. A beat." "I think he means it." "Okay," she said. "Is that..." He searched for the right end to the question. "Does that matter? For how things go?" She looked at the steps across the quad. The afternoon light was going now, the gold draining out of the marble, Maddox's eye, the steps returning to their ordinary institutional gray. "It matters," she said. "Not to the formal findings, those are based on documented evidence. But it matters for what comes after." She paused. "That's true for most things." Reeves stood there for a moment, hands pockets, looking at the building with the expression of someone recalibrating something internal. "I've been here 3 years," he said. "I thought I understood how this place worked." She looked at him. "You understood how it appeared to work." He thought about this. "That's the whole problem, isn't it?" "Yes," she said. "That's exactly the problem." The equipment officer slid her receipt across the counter. She took it, folded it once, and put it in her cargo pocket beside the small notebook with the reflective cover. Reeves pushed off the counter and straightened. "I'm going to mess." "You?" She glanced at the administrative building. Thorne's office window was lit again, the same warm rectangle against the settling dark. Somewhere inside it, or in the conference room below it, So and Fennick were building the formal evidentiary structure from her 13 days of observation. By tomorrow, Vance would have sat down with the ISD team and delivered what he'd said he would deliver. By the end of the week, the findings would be taking shape. 25 days ago, she'd come through the front entrance of Ironcrest with a worn rucksack and a precisely average file, and had climbed steps designed to be difficult, and had nearly gone down on marble stone in front of 60 people who decided she didn't matter. "Yeah," she said, "I'll go to mess." They walked across the quad in the early dark, and the Ironcrest steps threw long shadows onto the courtyard stone, and somewhere above them in the administrative wing, a phone rang twice, and then was answered, and the business of consequence, slow and institutional and unavoidable, continued without ceremony in the way that real consequences always did. The mess hall had the particular noise of people who were pretending everything was normal, which meant nothing was normal. Mara noticed it the moment she and Reeves came through the side entrance, the conversations running at slightly higher volume than usual. The clusters positioned differently than the standard social sorting that happened over the first 2 weeks of any cohort. People were grouping by information, not by company affiliation. The cadets who knew something were close together. The ones who didn't were orbiting them, trying to get near enough to hear without appearing to. She took a tray and went through the line and chose the same east side table she'd eaten at since day one, because changing that now would itself be a signal. Reeves sat across from her. He ate with the focused efficiency of someone who had processed enough for one day and was giving his brain a rest period. She ate and watched the room and noted 3 specific things that Okafor, the cadet Vance, had humiliated at the land navigation debrief. On day 2 was sitting with a different group than his usual one, closer to the center of the room, with the slightly lifted posture of someone whose social coordinates had shifted. That doll, Vance's large and largely silent shadow, was sitting alone at the far end of the Red Company section and had not touched his food, and that Vance himself was not in the mess hall at all. She finished eating, returned her tray, and went back to the East dormitory. The remaining 17 days of the assessment period had a different texture than the first 13. The cover was lifted at the senior level, but not the cadet level, the administrative decision, and ratified by Thorne and the ISD team, was that continuing the observation under modified conditions would produce more useful longitudinal data than terminating it. What this meant in practice was that Mara continued to attend formations, classes, and training blocks as an enrolled cadet, while the institutional machinery that her first 13 days had set in motion ground forward in the floors above. The ISD team conducted 31 interviews over 8 days. She knew this because Fennec told her in one of the 3 brief status conversations they had during the remaining period, delivered in corridor segments of 3 minutes each with the economy of people who understood that longer meetings left longer footprints. Vance's formal interview lasted 4 hours. Fennec didn't tell her what was said. She didn't ask. What she observed directly was that Vance came out of the ISD interview wing at 1,800 on day 16 and walked across the quad to the Ironcrest steps and sat on the 4th step from the bottom and stayed there for 40 minutes in the cold, not on his phone, not talking to anyone, just sitting with his elbows on his knees, looking at the stone between his boots. She saw this from the east dormitory window. She did not go out. At the end of 40 minutes, he stood up, squared his uniform, and went inside. She didn't know what he'd decided sitting there. She suspected he didn't either. Day 24 brought a development that hadn't been on any schedule. Sergeant First Class Decker called her to his office at 900, a small space near the equipment bay that smelled permanently of machine oil and old paper, and sat across from her at a desk that had more surface area devoted to coffee cups than actual work material, and told her, with the directness of a man who had spent 20 years figuring out how to say things that needed saying, that 3 junior instructors had independently provided ISD statements corroborating the pattern she documented in her assessment report. They'd been sitting on it, he said. Most of them for more than a year. She looked at him. What made them come forward? He picked up a pen and set it down. Couple things. The ISD channel being confidential. Seeing the process actually start. He paused, and knowing that someone had already documented it. It's easier to say what you know when you're not the only one saying it. She understood this. It was one of the structural reasons the Night Glass group used embedded assessment rather than anonymous reporting. A single report was easy to dismiss. A documented pattern was something else. What happens to the instructors, she said, depends on the finding category. The ones who observed conduct and didn't report it, that's a different accountability tier than the ones who actively participated. He looked at her. There are 2 in the second category. She filed this. One more thing, Decker said. He reached into his desk drawer and produced a folded piece of paper, which he slid across the desk without comment. She unfolded it. It was a handwritten note, 3 sentences, in handwriting she recognized from the grid reference conversation on day 2. She read it once. Then she folded it and put it in her cargo pocket. He left it with the admin office this morning, Decker said. Ask them to pass it to you. She stood. Thank you. Quinn. She stopped. He looked at her with the expression he'd been developing since the land navigation exercise, the one that was trying to categorize something without adequate vocabulary. You did the right thing, he said, the way you did it. Staying in it for the whole 30 days instead of pulling the evidence and walking. Staying in the room. He paused. That's harder than the alternative. She didn't argue with this. Yes, sir, she said. It is. She went back out into the building. In the east corridor stairwell, where the acoustics were private enough, she unfolded the note again. 3 sentences. Vance's handwriting, which was precise and slightly angular, the handwriting of someone who'd been told to work on it, and had. I've been thinking about what you said in the corridor. That the system tries to put unexpected people somewhere manageable. I never thought of myself as the system before. She folded it again and put it back in her pocket and stood in the stairwell for a moment, listening to the building around her, the distant clunk of doors, the muted voice of an instructor somewhere above, the knock of the radiator 2 floors up, even though it was late enough in the morning that the heating system should have cycled down. Then she kept moving. Day 30 arrived on a Tuesday with flat gray sky and the smell of coming rain that the mid-autumn air carried for hours before the rain actually showed up. Mara packed her rucksack in the east dormitory at 700 with the same compression straps and internal dividers she'd used on day 1, filling it in reverse order from how she'd unpacked it 17 days ago. The rack looked exactly as it had when she'd arrived. She'd brought little enough that leaving was simple. So, Dina was awake. She sat on her bunk with her periodic table and watched Mara pack with the single-syllable economy that was her characteristic mode. How long, Dina said. Day 30. I told you it might get complicated. You said probably okay first. It was. She clipped the top flap. Mostly. Dina was quiet for a moment. Then, are you actually in the military? Yes. The night glass thing. Mara looked at her. The name wasn't public information, but in an environment where 31 interviews had happened in 8 days. Information moved through walls. Where did you hear that? Marsh. Who heard it from someone in Red Company? Who I assume heard it from Reeves. She folded her periodic table printout precisely, creased it, unfolded it. You're a major. Yes. Dina processed this with the methodical calm of someone who had decided on day 1 that this roommate was unusual and had simply been waiting for the nature of the unusual to clarify. You read the whole exercise manual because that's what you do, not because you were trying to win the exercise. I was trying to understand the system, Mara said. Winning was a byproduct. That's a very specific way to live. Mara looked at her. Dina was 22 and from the Midwest and had a periodic table on her wall and processed the world with a precision that was its own kind of intelligence. She'd been a better roommate than the assignment deserved. It works for me, Mara said. Dina nodded. Then she held out her hand. It took Mara a half second to parse the gesture, not a military handshake, not a social performance, just a person offering their hand to another person at the end of something. She shook it. Good luck, Dina said, with whatever the next one is. You too, Mara said, with pre-med. She picked up her rucksack and her helmet bag and left. The formal presentation happened at 1000 in the main operations room. This had not been on the official schedule. It had been added to the Academy's calendar system at 8:30, 2 hours before, which meant it was the ISD team's decision and not the Academy's, which told her something about where the authority in the building currently resided. The cadet corps assembled in the tiered seating. Every instructor, every senior officer, the ISD team positioned at the front, Fennec at the center, with the composed authority of someone delivering findings. She'd spent 3 weeks building on an evidentiary foundation she was confident in. Mara sat in the middle of the Blue Company section, rucksack at her feet, in the same seat she'd occupied on day 3 for the Black Meridian Exercise brief. Fennec delivered the ISD finding summary in 40 minutes. Her language was formal and precise and completely unsparing. The document ran to 63 pages. What she read into the record was the finding categories and the institutional determinations. Category 8, Leadership Conduct Standards Systemic Deficiency Identified. Remediation Mandate Issued. Category 11, Cadet Welfare Mechanisms, Structural Failure in Anonymous Reporting Access. Remediation Mandate Issued. Category 13, Institutional Climate Formal Finding of Pervasive Conduct Pattern Affecting Cadet Welfare, Mandatory External Oversight for 24 months, Mandatory Reform Implementation within 90 days. She named no individual cadets in the formal reading. The individual conduct inquiries were separate processes with separate procedural protections. But she stated clearly that the institutional findings were supported by direct observational evidence, documentary evidence, and 31 sworn statements. The room had a very specific silence throughout. Not shocked, most people in the room had felt the shape of this coming for days, but waited. The particular weight of an institution hearing about itself in formal language and being unable to manage the framing. When Fennec finished, Sowe stepped forward. The ISD assessment was conducted using an embedded operative from Joint Command's Night Glass Group, he said. I'm disclosing this now because the assessment methodology will be part of the public record and because I believe the people in this room deserve to understand how the evidence was gathered. He paused. Major Mara Quinn served as the embedded assessor. She was enrolled as a scholarship cadet under a constructed cover identity for 30 days. Her assessment report is the core evidentiary document behind the institutional findings you've just heard. He looked at the Blue Company section. Every head in the room turned. Masha looked straight ahead and did not react, because reacting would have been its own kind of performance, and she didn't owe this room a performance. Then, so he said, Major Quinn. She stood. Please come forward. She picked up Nothing Left the rucksack where it was and walked down the aisle between the tiered seats to the front of the room. Her boot steps on the floor were the only sound. Her uniform was clean and pressed. The stare strip was gone from her cheek. The mark faded to the faint trace of something that had happened and healed. She stopped at the front and turned to face the room. Sowe stood to her right, Fennec to her left. And from the side entrance, 3 figures came in that she had not been told to expect. General Thorne, and beside him 2 generals she recognized from their service records, General Marcus Hale, Joint Command's Institutional Standards Director, and General Julian Cross, the Night Glass Group's Senior Military Liaison. She had met Cross once, briefly, in a hallway she wasn't supposed to discuss. The 3 generals arranged themselves in a line facing her. Thorne looked at her with the expression he'd been developing since day 1, the one that'd been trying to categorize something, and had finally found the category. He brought his right hand up in a salute, clean, deliberate. Hale and Cross raised their hands simultaneously, 3 generals saluting a woman in a battered scholarship cadet uniform. The silence in the room lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then, from somewhere in the instructor section, a hand came up. Then another. Then the sound of the entire front row of senior instructors coming to attention and saluting, and the row behind them. And the sound moved through the room like something physical, the shuffle of boots on the floor and hands coming up, and the particular sharp quality of an institution in catching itself doing something it would remember. She returned the salute. She held it for the correct 3 seconds, and then dropped it. The room settled. She turned to Thorne. His expression, up close, had the quality of a man who had started making phone calls at midnight on day 5 because something he'd watched on the Ironcrest steps had told him he didn't know what he was looking at and had spent 25 days finding out, and had found something that required recalibrating a great deal. "Major Quinn," he said, "thank you for your service to this institution." She held his gaze. "Thank you for asking the right questions, General." He almost smiled. It didn't quite complete the motion, but it was the closest she'd seen. The individual consequences came through over the following weeks through the formal conduct inquiry process, and it came through without softening. 2 instructors who had directly participated in creating the scholarship cadet disadvantage structure were removed from their positions pending administrative review. Both cases were referred to the Joint Command Inspector General for formal proceedings. 3 others received formal reprimands for failure to report observed conduct and were placed on performance improvement requirements. Vance's case took longer because his case was more complicated. The formal finding on his individual conduct inquiry was a level 2 leadership deficiency, serious enough to require mandatory counseling, a formal leadership development program, and a reduction in his command authority for 1 academic year. He was stripped of his cadet captain rank and reclassified as cadet sergeant, required to rebuild through the same performance channels available to every other cadet in the institution. He was not expelled. The inquiry panel's written justification, which Thorne shared with Mara as the assessment officer before she left the academy grounds, he had the authority to do this and exercised it with the same directness he'd applied to everything else, cited his voluntary cooperation, his unprompted acknowledgement of the pattern during the initial confrontation, and the assessment of the conduct as a product of institutional failure as well as individual failure. The institution that had never required him to examine his behavior shared accountability for the behavior it had never corrected. Mara read the justification carefully. Then she set it down and thought about the note in her cargo pocket, 3 sentences in precise angular handwriting, and the 40 minutes on the Ironcrest steps in the cold. She thought it was the right call. Not a comfortable call, the right call, which was a different thing. She left the academy at 1,400 on day 30, through the front entrance, down the Ironcrest steps. She took them at a normal pace. 4-inch risers, slightly narrower than standard, iron railings on both sides. The marble was cold under her boots, and the cloud cover had finally released the rain it had been holding since morning, a thin gray drizzle that made the stone darker and the campus quieter. At the bottom of the steps, she turned and looked up. The academy building stood the way institutional buildings stood, solid, indifferent, holding all its history in its walls with complete neutrality. It didn't know what it meant. It was stone and mortar and somebody's decision about the height of stairs. What it meant was a function of the people inside it, and the people inside it were, slowly and imperfectly, and with the resistance that real institutions always generated, beginning to change. She turned away and walked toward the vehicle that was waiting at the edge of the grounds. So was at the vehicle, looking at his phone. He looked up when she reached him. "Ready?" "Yes, sir." He opened the rear door. She put her rucksack in and got in after it, and he went around to the other side, and they drove through the academy gates and onto the road outside, and the Ironcrest building diminished in the rear window and then was gone behind the tree line. Soe looked at his phone for several minutes. She looked out the window at the wet road and the November trees. Then he said, "Reeves submitted a request this morning." She looked at him. "Transfer to the institutional assessment training track." He paused, cited the assessment period as his reasoning. He wrote, and I'm quoting directly, "I spent 3 weeks watching someone understand a system better than the system understood itself. I want to learn how to do that." She looked out the window again. The road was going north, away from Ironcrest, toward whatever came next. Is he a candidate? She said. The aptitude data says yes. The instinct data says definitely. Soe put his phone away. We'll see. She nodded and was quiet for a while. The rain moved across the windows in patterns that almost looked intentional. She watched it and thought about the Ironcrest steps and the exercise manual, and the 2 seconds she'd stayed still on the marble floor before standing up, and about Dina's periodic table, and Reeves's careful eyes, and Vance sitting alone on the 4th step in the cold, working something out that nobody could work out for him. She thought about what Decker had said, that's harder than the alternative, and she thought, he was right, and she thought the difficulty was not incidental to the value of it. The easy version of what she did would have produced a report and a finding and walked out on day 14. The version she'd stayed for had produced a report and a finding and something less quantifiable that she didn't have precise language for, but that she recognized when she saw it, the shift that happened in people when they were seen clearly, and the seeing had consequences, and then real time passed, and they had to decide, in the absence of any external pressure, what to do with that. What they did with that was their own. She couldn't control it and didn't try to. What she could do was her job, precisely, thoroughly, with the kind of patience that looked passive to people who didn't understand it. The vehicle drove on through the rain. She would be briefed on the next placement in 72 hours. Different institutional context, So had said. She didn't know what that meant yet. She would learn the environment, whatever documentation existed, she would read it completely, and it'd arrive quietly and establish herself into most visible where the power dynamics were most visible, and she would watch and document and wait. She was good at waiting. She was good at being the person in the room that nobody looked at, right up until what she'd seen in the room she'd been in made it impossible to look anywhere else. The tree line opened and the highway began, and the academy was miles behind them now, a fixed point that would change at its own institutional pace, in the ways that real change happened not dramatically, not all at once, but in the small daily decisions of the people inside who had been given a reason to make different ones. On the Ironcrest steps, every morning from now on, someone would climb them. And eventually, without announcement, without ceremony, they would stop thinking of them as a test and start thinking of them as just stairs, difficult ones, like most things worth climbing, that everyone inside those walls navigated together. That was enough. It was more than enough. The ones who are never seen coming are often the ones who change everything, not by announcing their power, but by using it only for what actually matters.